10-year-old black girl hands over her first-class ticket, only to have it ripped up in front of her. The flight attendant smirks, dismissing her like she's nothing. Passengers watch, but say nothing. What she doesn't know? This girl isn't just any passenger. She's Big Shaq's daughter. And when he arrives, the entire airport goes silent. Power shifts, egos crumble, and a lesson unfolds that no one will ever forget. Some mistakes can't be undone. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport was alive with movement, a chaotic blend of rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, and hurried conversations. Families gathered for goodbyes, business travelers checked their watches impatiently, and airport employees maneuvered through the crowds with practiced efficiency. Autumn Carter stood at gate 12, her small frame barely reaching the check-in counter, her backpack strapped tight against her shoulders. In her right hand, she held her golden ticket, a first-class boarding pass purchased by her father, Big Shaq. This wasn't her first time flying. In fact, it wasn't even her first time flying alone. Her father had always ensured she traveled in comfort, booking her the best seats and treating her like the princess he knew she was. "You deserve the best, princess," he had told her when he handed her the ticket. And she had believed it. But as she stepped toward the gate agent, something shifted. It wasn't the buzz of the airport, nor the hurried movements of the passengers. It was the way Olivia Warren, the woman standing behind the counter, was looking at her. Olivia barely glanced up at first, her attention fixed on the tablet in front of her. But the second she saw Autumn, her entire expression changed. The polished, professional smile froze at the edges, twisting into something else. Doubt, suspicion, annoyance. Autumn knew that look. She had seen it before. The kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." She was dressed just like any other kid at the airport. Jeans, a pink hoodie, and fresh white sneakers. A small backpack hung off her shoulders, the straps snug against her frame. Nothing about her screamed out of place. And yet, in Olivia's sharp blue eyes, Autumn could see it clear as day. She wasn't being seen as a regular passenger. She was being treated like an intruder. Still, she stood her ground. She wasn't about to be dismissed. Olivia's fingers tapped against the counter, her lips curving into a forced, too sweet smile. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you lost?" Autumn's brows pulled together slightly. Lost? What kind of question was that? She had walked up to the first-class check-in desk. She had presented a ticket. What about her looked lost? She straightened her spine, her grip on the ticket tightening. "No," she said simply. "I'm flying first class." With a polite but firm motion, she held up her ticket, just as her father had taught her to do. The moment she said it, she saw the shift. The fake warmth in Olivia's expression vanished. The tight-lipped customer service smile flattened, turning into a thin, unimpressed line. And just like that, the mask fell. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her eyes flicking between Autumn's face and the ticket in her hand. Then she let out a soft, amused scoff. "That's cute," Olivia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But first class isn't a playground? These seats are very expensive." The words landed like an invisible slap. Autumn's hands curled into tight fists at her sides. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't mistaken. She belonged here. A few passengers had started to notice. Some stole sideways glances, watching but saying nothing. A businessman in a tailored suit frowned slightly but didn't intervene. A woman in a designer coat leaned toward her companion, whispering. They were all witnessing something, but nobody stepped in. Because that's how these things always went. And Olivia? She knew it. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her smirk deepening. She was waiting for Autumn to back down, for her to look embarrassed, to shrink away, to step aside, to quietly accept that she didn't belong. But Autumn didn't move. She refused to shrink. Instead, she stared right back at Olivia, heart pounding, but feet planted firmly. "I have a ticket," she said, voice steady. "Just like everyone else." Olivia let out an exaggerated sigh. "Look, sweetheart, I'll save you the embarrassment." She motioned toward the economy boarding lane, where other passengers were lining up. First class is for paying customers. Why don't you head over to economy and find a seat there? Autumn's stomach dropped. Her father had paid. She had a right to be here. So why was she the only one being questioned? She shook her head. No, Rip. The sound was deafening. Autumn's heart stopped. Right in front of her, Olivia had ripped the ticket in half, tore it down the middle, effortlessly, like it meant nothing. Passengers gasped. One man muttered, "Did she just—" But Olivia? She just smirked. Holding up the two useless pieces, her eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. Nice try, sweetheart. Go wait in economy. Autumn stood frozen. Her mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She looked down at the shredded ticket, then back up at Olivia's cold, smug face. A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let the tears come. She could hear the whispers now. Some passengers looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. A woman standing near the gate let out a soft tisk, but said nothing. Autumn's fingers trembled. She wanted to scream, argue, demand justice. But then a new thought cut through the humiliation. A single, undeniable truth. Her father, Big Shaq. He was just one call away. Autumn's hands were steady as she reached for her phone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She was about to make a call that Olivia would never forget. The phone barely rang twice before a deep, controlled voice answered. "Princess?" Autumn took a breath, her voice calm but firm. "Dad, they ripped up my ticket." Silence. Not confused silence. Not hesitant silence. Not unsure silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then, in a voice so steady it sent chills down her spine, Big Shaq spoke. "Who did?" Autumn's eyes locked onto Olivia's smug, oblivious expression. Her voice was quiet but certain. "Some flight attendant." A slow, deep inhale on the other end of the line. Then, the final words that set everything in motion. "Stay put. I'll handle it." The ripped ticket hung in Olivia Warren's fingers like a trophy, the torn edges flapping slightly as the airport's air conditioning hummed overhead. She had expected resistance, a tantrum maybe, even tears. What she hadn't expected was silence. Autumn Carter didn't cry. She didn't plead or beg. She didn't even move at first. She just stared at the shredded remains of her first-class ticket, her jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. She could feel the weight of every stare around her. The hushed murmurs of passengers who had watched it all unfold and said nothing. The judgment in Olivia's mocking smirk. Autumn's breath was steady, controlled. But inside, a fire was raging. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time she had seen that smirk, that dismissive tilt of the head, that fake politeness masking something uglier. But it would be the last time anyone got away with it. Because Olivia Warren had no idea who she had just disrespected. Olivia casually brushed her hands together, like she had just finished taking out the trash. In her mind, this was over. Another kid trying to pull a fast one, another problem solved before takeoff. She turned to the agent next to her, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound like she wasn't gossiping, but loud enough that she absolutely was. "She probably stole it," Olivia muttered. Her coworker, a younger man who had been watching the whole thing with increasing discomfort, hesitated. "Olivia, I don't know. That seemed kinda what?" Olivia cut him off, her smile never wavering. "If she actually had a ticket, she wouldn't have let me rip it up. She would have called someone over. She would have done something." The young agent opened his mouth, then shut it. He didn't have an argument for that. And Olivia? She took that as a win. All around them, passengers pretended to be busy. A businessman in an expensive charcoal suit adjusted his watch, sneaking a glance at Autumn. He had seen everything. He had heard everything. He cleared his throat. If she had the ticket, why'd she rip it up? The woman beside him, dressed in a crisp white blazer, sighed. "It's not our business. Maybe it was a mistake." A mistake. That was the excuse, the justification. And that's what everyone would tell themselves later. That they had seen something wrong. but it wasn't their place to get involved. Autumn felt their eyes on her, their useless concern. But she didn't waste time looking for help. She already knew where to find it. Autumn reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't rush, didn't stammer, didn't second-guess herself. With deliberate, practiced movements, she swiped to her recent calls, tapped the most dialed number, and put the phone to her ear. The call barely rang twice. Then, a voice. Deep, unshaken, controlled. Princess? Autumn's throat tightened slightly, but her voice was steady. Dad, they ripped up my ticket. Silence. Not a hesitant silence. Not confused. Not unsure. A silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down her spine, Big Shaq spoke again. Who did? Autumn's grip tightened on the phone. Across from her, Olivia hadn't even noticed she was making a call. She was too busy soaking in her victory, too busy moving on to the next passenger, too busy underestimating the very person she had just humiliated. Autumn glanced at her, then with quiet confidence she answered her father. Some flight attendant. Olivia something. A pause. Then a low exhale. Stay where you are. Autumn nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Because when her father said he would handle something, he meant it. Across the terminal, in a private lounge reserved for elite travelers and executives, Shaq slowly set his phone down on the polished marble table in front of him. He didn't speak right away, didn't react. But the people around him felt it immediately. His assistant stopped typing. His security detail straightened, waiting for instruction. The executives he had been casually speaking with moments before suddenly knew that whatever conversation they were having, it was over. Shaq was a lot of things. A businessman, a CEO, a self-made multimillionaire. But above everything else, he was a father. And someone had just messed with his daughter. A mistake they wouldn't be making twice. Shaq slowly pushed back his chair and stood. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted the Rolex on his wrist, then turned to his assistant, his voice still eerily calm. Call the airline manager. A beat. Actually, don't. A slow, calculated pause. I'll handle it myself. And with that, Shaq stepped out of the private lounge, walking toward the biggest mistake Olivia Warren had ever made. The hum of engines filled the air as the private jet stood ready for takeoff, its sleek exterior gleaming under the airport lights. Inside the VIP lounge, Shaq sat at the head of a polished glass table, fingers lightly tapping the armrest of his chair. His assistant stood nearby, tablet in hand, waiting for the final go-ahead. The pilots had confirmed everything was set. But then, his phone buzzed. It wasn't an unscheduled business call. It wasn't an executive asking for a last-minute deal. It was Autumn. The room fell into silence as Shaq picked up the phone, bringing it to his ear with a measured slowness. His staff knew the rules. When Shaq was on a call with his daughter, nothing else mattered. But the moment he heard her voice, something in his demeanor shifted. Dad, they ripped up my ticket. A pause. A slow, heavy pause. His fingers tightened slightly against the armrest. The tapping stopped. The air in the lounge turned sharp, electric, charged with something unspoken. His assistant, standing just a few feet away, lowered her tablet instinctively, sensing the change. Shaq's voice remained low, steady, too controlled. Who did? Autumn glanced at the flight attendant still standing smugly at the gate, looking through her passenger list as if nothing had happened. She swallowed hard. Some flight attendant. Another pause, longer this time. Then, in a tone that sent ice through the air, Shaq said 3 simple words. Stay put. I'll handle it. The moment Shaq hung up, the VIP lounge no longer felt like a place of relaxation. His assistant stood perfectly still, tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. His security team, stationed near the door, exchanged a brief but knowing glance. The executives he had been casually speaking with just minutes ago. They didn't dare interrupt, because Shaq wasn't rushing. And that was the problem. A man like him, one of the most powerful and respected figures in the business world, didn't need to shout to be heard. He just needed to stand. Which is exactly what he did. With a slow, deliberate movement, Shaq pushed back his chair and rose to his full height. His suit jacket remained perfectly in place, every motion precise, controlled. He glanced at his assistant. "Cancel the jet. It can wait." The assistant gave a single nod, her fingers already moving across the tablet. Shaq adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, then walked toward the door, his pace unhurried. But everyone in that room knew. He wasn't just leaving. He was heading toward a lesson that needed to be taught. Autumn hadn't moved, not because she was scared, but because her father had told her not to. And when Shaq told you to stay put, you stayed put. Olivia, still behind the check-in counter, barely glanced at her again. To her, the problem was handled. She had made her point. Kept first class exclusive, just like it was supposed to be. Autumn could practically hear her own heartbeat in her ears, not from nerves, but from anticipation, because she knew what was about to happen. And Olivia, she had no idea. 15 minutes later, the energy in the terminal shifted. Passengers who had been idly scrolling through their phones or making small talk suddenly looked up, sensing something different. One by one, heads began to turn toward the entrance. The first thing people noticed was the security team, two sharp-dressed men walking in like they owned the place. Then came the man himself, Shaq. Tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored black suit, the watch on his wrist glinting under the fluorescent lights. His walk was slow, unbothered, but undeniably commanding. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look around. He already knew exactly where to go. And everyone in that terminal felt it. A businessman, the same one who had muttered about the torn ticket earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman in the white blazer, who had dismissed the entire thing as a misunderstanding, suddenly sat straighter, pushing her sunglasses onto her head, because they recognized him now. The name, the face, the power. And suddenly, the silence they had sat in earlier felt suffocating. At the check-in desk, Olivia was in the middle of boarding another passenger when she heard the shift in conversation. She furrowed her brows slightly, glancing up, and then she saw him. Her stomach dropped. The ticket scanner in her hand suddenly felt too heavy. Shaq was walking straight toward her, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto the counter. Every passenger near the front gate stopped moving. One woman lowered her coffee cup mid-sip. A man who had been talking loudly on the phone went silent. The air felt different. Olivia's pulse spiked, but still, she held her ground. This was just another passenger, another entitled businessman trying to intimidate her. She squared her shoulders, forcing a tight-lipped smile as he stopped in front of her counter. "Can I help you, sir?" Shaq didn't blink, didn't speak right away. He just looked at her. And in that look, Olivia felt everything shift. Because for the first time since she had torn up that little girl's ticket, she realized she had made a mistake. Shaq let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders. Then, finally, in a voice calm enough to send chills through the air, he asked a single question. "Where's my daughter's ticket?" The color drained from Olivia's face. The passengers watching held their breath. The businessman from earlier muttered under his breath, "Oh, damn." And just like that, the power in the room shifted completely. Olivia wasn't in control anymore, and now, she was about to find out exactly who she had messed with. The airport's main terminal hummed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing, announcements crackling, and luggage wheels dragging across polished floors. But within seconds, that familiar noise shifted, dulled, like the entire space had suddenly become aware of something different. A sleek black SUV rolled to a smooth stop outside the terminal doors. The kind of car that didn't just pull up, it arrived. The uniformed valet barely had time to step forward before the rear door swung open. Shaq stepped out. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. His presence alone sent a ripple through the air, a gravitational force that people unconsciously reacted to. His tailored suit, crisp and dark, sat perfectly against his broad frame. His gold watch glinted subtly under the terminal lights as he adjusted his cuff. A slow, deliberate motion that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. He didn't glance around. Didn't need to. He already knew exactly where he was going. Inside, near Gate 12, the energy shifted before anyone even laid eyes on him. Passengers chatting over coffee suddenly paused, their conversations trailing off. A woman scrolling through her phone blinked up, sensing something before she even understood what it was. Even the airport staff, mid-shift and numb to celebrity sightings, began to straighten slightly, their instincts whispering that someone important had just walked in. At the check-in counter, Olivia was still smirking, still carrying herself with the untouchable arrogance of someone who thought she had already won. She leaned toward a fellow flight attendant, chuckling under her breath. Honestly, that little girl thought she was slick. I barely even had to try. Her coworker gave an awkward half-laugh, shifting uncomfortably. He had heard the whispers from the nearby passengers. Something was happening. And then, the terminal air seemed to thicken. A presence moved through the crowd, cutting through the space like a sharp blade. People stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. Conversations died. A slow wave of recognition rippled through the rows of first-class passengers seated near the gate. Someone whispered, "Wait, is that?" A man in a suit leaned forward, his voice dropping into something close to awe. "That's Big Shaq." Oblivious to the growing tension around her, Olivia turned back to her computer screen, preparing to scan the next passenger in line. Then, a shadow moved over her desk. She barely registered it at first. Just another traveler. Just another problem to brush off. But something about the way the people around her had gone dead silent sent a strange chill up her spine. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Slowly, she looked up. And then, her world tilted. Her smirk vanished. Her shoulders stiffened. It took a full second for her brain to process what she was seeing. The man standing in front of her counter wasn't some angry parent. He wasn't just another customer looking to argue about a delayed flight. He was Big Shaq. And he was staring directly at her. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. The weight of 100 passengers' stares pressed down on her. Her mouth suddenly felt dry, her fingers curling against the desk, as if she could somehow anchor herself to the ground. She tried, desperately tried, to find her usual mask of authority, the one she had worn so easily when talking down to that little girl just minutes ago. But it wouldn't come. Because now she was the one at a disadvantage. The silence in the terminal stretched, thick and suffocating. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Passengers, employees, everyone knew something was about to happen. And the worst part? Shaq wasn't angry. He wasn't fuming. He wasn't yelling. That would have been easier. Instead, he just stood there, calm, unshaken, towering in absolute controlled authority. And Olivia? She had nowhere to run. Shaq let the silence stretch, let Olivia feel it. Then in a voice so level it sent chills through the room, he finally spoke. "Where's my daughter's ticket?" A single question. But it shattered Olivia's confidence like glass hitting pavement. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, forcing a breath. But no excuse would come. Because there wasn't one. She had made a decision. And now, she was standing face to face with the consequences. A man in first class, who had been pretending to mind his own business, suddenly found himself sitting up straighter. The woman in the white blazer, who had been so quick to dismiss everything before, lowered her coffee cup slowly, her fingers gripping the sleeve. Because now, they saw it for what it really was. This wasn't just about a flight attendant making a mistake. This was about power, who had it, who thought they could abuse it, and what happened when they chose the wrong person to test. And Olivia? She had just learned the hard way that she was never in control to begin with. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink, didn't rush to fill the silence. Because he didn't need to. The weight of the moment, the absolute undeniable realization of her mistake, was doing the job for him. Olivia swallowed hard, her lips parting, a desperate attempt to regain her footing. "Sir, there must have been a..." Shaq tilted his head slightly, just enough to make her stop talking. She had already lost. And now she was about to find out what real power looked like. Olivia's breath came in short, shallow bursts, her once confident posture crumbling under the weight of 100 watching eyes. The first-class passengers, the airline staff, the economy travelers peeking over from the next gate, all of them were watching. Her throat tightened. Her hands, normally steady and in control, hovered stiffly over the check-in counter, fingers gripping the edge as if it could anchor her. She had handled angry customers before. She had even argued with elite travelers, the rich, the entitled, the ones who thought their money meant they owned the world. But this was different. Because this wasn't just another passenger. This was Big Shaq. And right now, he wasn't even angry. He was just waiting. And somehow, that was worse. Olivia forced a breath, trying to regain even a shred of control. I thought she wasn't a first-class passenger. The second the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Because Shaq didn't blink, didn't frown, didn't scowl. He simply tilted his head slightly, watching her like she was a puzzle missing half its pieces. Then, his voice calm, steady, and far too controlled, he asked, "And you thought that because?" The room tensed. Passengers exchanged glances, some raising their phones, their cameras now recording. A businessman in a navy suit, one who had originally dismissed the situation, passengers muttered, scoffing under their breath. A woman near the boarding lane shook her head. A father standing with his young daughter frowned, gripping his child's hand just a little tighter. Because they all saw it. They all felt it. This wasn't about a ticket. It was about assumption. And Olivia had just been exposed. Shaq, still calm, still unshaken, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few slow, effortless taps, he pulled up the airline's passenger list. Seconds later, Autumn Carter's name appeared, clear as day, on the first-class manifest. The confirmation screen, the booking details, the undeniable proof. Shaq turned the screen toward Olivia. "So, explain this." Her face drained of color. The words sat there, staring back at her, taunting her, exposing her. Passengers leaned in, whispering. One woman murmured, "She had the ticket the whole time?" Another scoffed, "Wow, this is embarrassing." Olivia's chest tightened. No more excuses, no more twisting the situation to her advantage. She had ripped up a first-class ticket that had been 100% legitimate, and now, the whole world knew. A sudden shuffle of footsteps broke the tension as a man in a suit, the gate manager, hurried onto the scene. His forehead glistened with sweat. His tie, usually pristine, looked slightly loosened, as if he already knew his day had just gone from bad to worse. He wasn't stupid. He had heard the whispers, seen the crowd forming, noticed the phones raised, recording, the undeniable tension hanging over the gate like a storm cloud. He barely had time to open his mouth before Shaq, still eerily calm, spoke first. His voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be, but it carried. "Your employee just ripped up my daughter's first-class ticket in front of a full crowd." The manager's expression crumpled. A sharp inhale, a nervous glance toward Olivia. Then, like a man walking toward his own execution, he turned to her. "Tell me that's not true." Olivia opened her mouth. But this time, there was no confidence, no fake smile, no sharp, patronizing tone. Because there was nothing left to say. Her excuses, gone. Her control, shattered. The power she had flexed over a 10-year-old girl just minutes ago had collapsed under the weight of one undeniable truth. She had messed with the wrong person, and now, she was about to pay the price. Shaq didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't celebrate her downfall, because this was never about Olivia. This was about his daughter, and making sure something like this never happened again. He took a measured step forward, his towering presence making the manager visibly flinch. Then, his voice dropped to something even lower, even more dangerous. "Fix it. Now." The final blow. The words that held more weight than any argument Olivia could have made. And at that moment, she knew. It was over. The shift in energy was undeniable. The airport terminal, once filled with indifference and routine conversations, was now thick with tension and anticipation. Where there had been casual glances, there were now locked stares. Where passengers had once pretended not to see, they now watched with undeniable interest. Some watched out of curiosity, eager to witness what would happen next. Some watched out of guilt, ashamed that they had stayed silent when it mattered most. And some were just waiting to see Olivia fall. It wasn't often that someone like her, someone used to power, used to control, was put in her place. And now, she wasn't just answering to an angry customer, she was standing before Big Shaq. And more importantly, she was answering to an entire room full of people who had finally found their voice. Behind the check-in counter, the manager was scrambling. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for any way to reverse the disaster Olivia had just created. Every few seconds he stole a nervous glance at Shaq, his posture rigid, his movements stiff, as if expecting the worst. And he wasn't wrong to be afraid. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake. This was about accountability. And Shaq? Shaq wasn't leaving without it. The sound of rapid typing filled the terminal, but it did nothing to drown out the whispers growing around them. For the first time since this ordeal began, passengers started speaking. It started as a few murmurs, hesitant and uncertain. Then it grew, louder, bolder. A businessman in an expensive Navy suit, who had spent most of the incident pretending to check emails, finally shook his head. His voice carried over the tense silence. Why'd she rip the ticket in the first place? A woman in a designer coat, who had watched everything unfold from the beginning, scoffed. Exactly. Why didn't she believe the kid? She didn't even check the system before tearing it up. A middle-aged father, standing nearby with his young daughter, tightened his grip on her small hand. His voice was sharp, filled with something that hadn't been there before. Would she have done this to a different child? Olivia felt the words like slaps. Because now it wasn't just Shaq standing against her. It was the entire room. Olivia flinched, not physically, but internally. Everything inside her was folding under the weight of their stares. For the first time since this started, she wasn't in control. She was no longer the one giving orders, making assumptions, holding the power. Now, she was the one being judged. She had thought she was putting a child in her place. Instead, she had just ruined herself. And Shaq? He wasn't even done yet. Shaq turned his attention back to Olivia, his expression unreadable, his presence impossible to ignore. And then, in a voice so steady, so slow, so utterly commanding, he said one word. Apologize. The word landed like a hammer. Olivia's stomach tightened. Her pride, the very arrogance that had fueled her decisions up until this moment, screamed at her to resist. She had never been forced to do this before. She was the one in control. She gave orders. But now she had none. The entire terminal was watching. Passengers, staff, her own co-workers. Even the manager, still frantically printing a replacement ticket, froze mid-typing. There was nowhere left to hide. Olivia swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, tight, suffocating. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. Sorry. The word was lifeless, hollow, not regretful, not sincere, just fearful. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He simply raised an eyebrow. Louder. Olivia's breath hitched, because she knew this wasn't a request. Passengers leaned in, waiting. Some held up their phones, recording. She could already imagine the headlines, the articles, the viral clips. Gate agent humiliates child, faces billionaire father's wrath. Her jaw clenched. Her pride screamed at her to fight back. But what could she say? She had no power here anymore. So she did the only thing she could. She straightened, cleared her throat, and forced the words out through gritted teeth. I'm sorry. The entire terminal stood in silence. The manager exhaled, relieved to no longer be in the direct line of fire. Shaq? He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't throw it in her face. He simply nodded. Then, with calm finality, he turned, took Autumn's hand, and began walking toward the first-class boarding lane. Autumn felt the weight lift off her shoulders. This time, when she walked toward the gate, no one stopped her. No one questioned her. Because now, everyone knew exactly who she was. And just as they passed Olivia, standing rigid behind the counter, her face drained of all arrogance and superiority. Autumn glanced up. Her voice was light, carefree, confident. "Thanks for saving me a better seat." Then, without waiting for a reaction, she turned back to her father, stepping onto the jet bridge, where she had belonged all along. The hum of the engines vibrated softly beneath their feet as Shaq and Autumn settled into their first-class seats. The plush leather, the soft overhead lighting, the murmured conversations of high-paying passengers. It was everything first class was supposed to be. But tonight, it felt different. The air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Not because of discomfort, but because every single person who had sat silent at that gate now realized they had witnessed something much bigger than a denied ticket. They had watched a power struggle unfold, an injustice brought to light, and a quiet reckoning take place. And none of them would ever forget it. A businessman, the same one who had only spoken up when things got bad, shifted in his seat, glancing toward Shaq. He wasn't sure if he should say something, acknowledge what had happened, or just sit with the shame of his earlier silence. A woman in designer heels adjusted her scarf, staring at the untouched champagne in her glass. She had watched the whole thing unfold, had whispered about it, had filmed part of it, but she hadn't done anything. And now, sitting just a few seats away from the man who had refused to stay silent, she felt smaller. In the row behind them, a father held his young daughter's hand a little tighter. His jaw clenched as he thought about what could have happened if that had been his little girl. The weight of it settled on every single person in that cabin. They had all been part of that moment. Now, they would have to carry it. Meanwhile, back at Gate 12, Olivia sat stiffly in the manager's office. The cheap overhead light buzzed above her, making the tiny room feel even more suffocating. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the dismissive tone, the air of superiority she had carried like a shield. She was silent now. Her hands, usually so quick to point, to demand, to deny, were now clenched into fists on her lap. The manager standing across from her was flipping through a printed report, one that included multiple complaints, witness statements, and the recorded footage from the incident. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Olivia, do you have any idea what you've done?" She said nothing, because really, what was there to say? She had assumed, she had humiliated, she had torn up a legitimate ticket and treated a little girl like she was nothing, and now she was the one being discarded. The airline's legal team had already stepped in, their PR department was scrambling, the CEO had been notified. And Olivia? She was about to become a cautionary tale. Within hours, the airline's social media accounts released a formal statement. "We sincerely apologize to Autumn Carter and her family for the unacceptable treatment she experienced at our gate. We take this matter seriously and are conducting a full review of our training and policies to ensure this never happens again." The post was shared, retweeted, commented on thousands of times. Some passengers who had been at the scene confirmed everything. Others demanded Olivia be fired immediately. Some called it performative. Some called it too little, too late. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going away. The airline rushed to implement new anti-discrimination policies, updated their employee training programs, and issued a direct apology to Shaq and Autumn. But Shaq? He didn't need an apology. He needed people to learn. As the plane climbed higher, the city lights shrinking below them, Autumn finally exhaled. She looked over at her dad, who sat calm, unreadable, staring ahead like he had already moved on. But Autumn hadn't. She turned to him, voice small but certain. "That wasn't the first time." Shaq glanced at her, brow slightly raised. "What wasn't?" She hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of the seat's armrest. "The first time someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong." Shaq studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "It won't be the last either." Autumn swallowed, her young mind processing what that meant. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it was the truth. Shaq leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just for her. "Never let anyone tell you where you belong." Autumn met his gaze, and for the first time since the flight started, she smiled. Because tonight, she had learned something no textbook could ever teach her. And it was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Some stories aren't just entertainment, they're a wake-up call. What happened to Autumn happens every day, but this time, the right person fought back. What would you do in that moment? Stay silent or take a stand? Don't just watch, be part of the conversation. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and demand change. Your voice matters.